Okay, today it is how to connect to your higher self. Before we start, this is the book I co-wrote with my guides that you see me channel every week. There's a link to purchase this book below the video. It's available also in audiobook and ebook. If you would like to have a private channel, that's something that we can do as well. So also you'll see below this video there is a link which takes you to a form, and then you complete the form. That just starts a conversation. It doesn't commit you to anything. And lastly, before we get started, if you enjoy this video, please like, share, comment, subscribe. There we go. I got them all in. I usually forget one or two. Okay, so how to connect to your higher self. Here we go. Greetings and thank you for the question. How to connect to the higher self. This is a pertinent question at this time because there is a rebirth of humanity's belief in its own divinity. Rather than being born from original sin or being the imperfect being, there is a growing pondering of what it is that lays beyond the physical reality, and also the belief of who one is. And this very naturally turns the spiritual gaze towards this higher aspect of self. And as this phenomenon continues, then there will be increasing investigation. So let this channel be in some way a contribution to that. However, let us first clarify the question. So, we shall begin in this way. To say how to connect to the higher self infers that the higher self is separate from you. Yet this is a misnomer, because you are the higher self. There is no separation other than the separation which you perceive, but it is a perception rather than a truth. The separation is perceived, where you know yourself as this being you can see in the mirror, and yet you feel there is something mysterious about the higher self. It is something which is awakened or is called upon, or you develop an awareness of when you have become masterful in who you are. However, you are the higher self. There is no separation. You literally are the higher self. And you are the higher self having a physical experience. So it'd be more accurate to say how to be the higher self in your physical experience. This points much more succinctly to what it is that is desired to understand with this original question, how to connect to the higher self. One wishes to connect to the higher self so they may draw into themselves this higher wisdom, which is part of the higher self aspect. But, as we shall repeat often throughout this channel, you are the higher self. So, it is not a connection that needs to be made, but rather an understanding of how the apparatus functions, so that you can use it more skillfully, more congruent to the intended design, such that you be the higher self in the physical experience. The avatar that you know yourself as, this flesh suit, the body, mind, personality, they are tools to facilitate the functioning of higher self in physical experience. The higher self has objectives, has desires, and this toolkit is what has been given to you such that those desires, those objectives can be achieved in the physical experience. So the greater purpose of discovering who you are, of realizing that you are the one experientially, can be achieved. And thereby, the one's purpose is also achieved. Because, as we have said many times, you are the one. The one is experiencing itself through the unique perspective which is you. You are a proxy for the one, so that it may know itself experientially. The avatar is the mind, body, personality. And the mind component of this apparatus has a high degree of autonomy. It is, in a sense, a biological artificial intelligence. It has been given the computation and abstract skills and so on, such that it can be called upon as a computing device to facilitate the higher self desires and objectives in the physical experience. But in the confusion of non-remembrance, which is part of the process of being born into the earth human experience at this time, where you are born with a complete absence of understanding that you are in fact the higher self, that you are in fact connected to the one, that you are in fact a being of the light, that you are in fact connected to all others within the larger aspect of who you are, the humanity being. It is a necessary part of the design in your experience, such that the purpose of transitioning from spiritual dichotomy to awakening as the being of light and transitioning into a state of unity. In this context, it becomes very easy for one to assume they are the mind. And as this misidentification, this misconception of what one is so profound, especially in the absence of this sacred knowledge that you are in fact the higher self, which has been expunged from your culture deliberately. Because this higher aspect, the truth of who you are, is powering, is liberating, is access to a degree of understanding and wakefulness and realization and epiphany that would transform you into a being that cannot be easily manipulated, cannot be easily misled. And if you and your fellow humans were that type of being, then those that seek to have dominion over your planet and are following the philosophical pathway of darkness would have very little sway on a population which is so wakeful. So, this mindset then that you must connect to the higher self, because it is separate from you, is not surprising. It is to be expected that this would be inherent to the starvation of your culture in the spiritual sense. There is a spiritual famine on your planet which has been deliberately created, yet it is coming to an end. So, in this state of identification with the mind in a sense begins to act as a mask. And the mask believes, when it sees its reflection, that it is the being, that it is the identity. Not realizing that in fact it is the presence which is looking out through the eye holes, which is the true designation of that being, of self. So this is the state on your planet, that most of you are believing the mask is you, when in fact you are the presence behind the mask. So, let us describe it also using this analogy. Imagine that you are using a virtual reality game. And in that game, you are the character, doing your adventures, and you can see your hands in front of you, and you must go here, you must go there, you must do this, you must do that. But in all the time that you are playing the game, you realize, when you look at the hands, that this is not you, that this is a character that you are playing. And the true you is the presence behind the VR goggles that is animating the character just as animating a puppet. Well, this is a very good analogy of what is actually happening, because when you see yourself in the mirror and you look at your hands, that is not who you are. You are the presence that is animating this meat puppet. You are the puppeteer, and the puppeteer is the higher self. So, continue with this analogy. If when playing the VR game, you understand that you are the presence behind the goggles, well then how does this translate to this greater truth that you are the higher self? This is how. When your mind is silent, yet you are still aware that you are there, that you are present. That is awareness of the higher self. In a sense, you exist between your thoughts. When you are thinking, your mind is claiming the highest position in the hierarchy. And it is when the mind goes silent that your true self, your higher self, is what fills the space as your presence. So, If you are the higher self and the mind is a tool which has been granted to you to facilitate the desires and objectives of the higher self in the physical experience, then what is the correct way to use this apparatus? Begin by acknowledging that you are not the mind, that you are not the avatar, and you are in fact the higher self, which is animating the avatar such that it can achieve its objectives. And the overarching objective is to understand itself, to know itself through experience. And so, the true hierarchy is that the higher self is always at the pinnacle, and the mind is a servant to the higher self aspect, and it is called upon. And when its service is complete, then it returns to silence. The master does not think very much. The master is present as the higher self aspect in a mindscape of silence, and thinks only when it is essential. The master is not plagued by incessant thought that one does not wish to have, thought which is unpleasant. In that scenario, where there is the incessant thought, the unpleasant thought which is unwanted, this has been a usurping by the mind and identification in the mind, because the mind can only claim this position of authority when one identifies with the mind. And when one identifies with the mind, so that the mask believes that it is the being, then this opens the capacity to identify with emotional states which are not you. Meaning, to identify with emotional qualities from the darkness end of the spiritual spectrum. The higher self aspect is completely of the light, does not have a dichotomous state. It is in a complete state of unity and alignment with the lightness end of the spiritual spectrum. And so it is not possible, even if it wished to identify with the darkness end of the spiritual spectrum. And this is part of the reason why it has chosen to have the physical experience, such that scenarios such as this become a possibility. It can have the experience of identifying with the darkness for the purpose of having the greater experience of realizing incrementally through revelation and epiphany that it is in fact the light, experiencing itself as the light in the physical experience. This is very rewarding for the higher self. And that is why it has chosen to be incarnated. Or rather, you have chosen to be incarnated into the earth human experience, such that that scenario can play out. So, the mind has the capacity to misidentify, to misconceive of self, and assume that it is the darkness. I am angry. I am afraid. I am sad. So, when you are living in a masterful state, the mind is not choosing these emotional qualities, this misidentification, misconception of self as the emotional qualities from the darkness end of the spiritual spectrum, fear and its derivatives. Instead, it is commanded to remain silent. And in its silence, the higher self is present. And the higher self is of the light. It is a being of spiritual unity. It has no dichotomy. It is love and its derivatives and nothing else. So, very naturally, one is filled with those qualities in a state where the top of the hierarchical chain within self is the higher self, and the mind is relegated to silence as the servant to the higher self, called upon only when its functionality is required. So, how does one become aware of the higher self? This also is a misnomer. If this self, how does one self become aware of the higher self? This one self is still identification with the mind. And the mind is a biological artificial intelligence that is inherent to the device, to the apparatus. And it has been designed to process the senses. And it does not have extra dimensional awareness. It can only have awareness of the here and now. When you are able to contemplate greater truths which are faith-based, then this is not functioning of the mind, but this is instead awareness of the higher self. It is a wisdom state, not a mental state. The mind is incapable of extra-dimensional awareness. Yet you are an extra-dimensional being, this higher self aspect. And so it is literally impossible for the mind to have awareness of the higher self aspect. So the mind cannot find you. It can only recede into silence, such that you can then fill the space with the presence of the higher self, of who you truly are. And this is why mind silence is so vitally important. If you are going to be a high functioning human being, you must spend some of your time dedicated specifically to silencing the mind. So this higher self aspect, the true you, can feel the space as your presence. And with practice, more and more, in this state of what you call meditation, although it does not specifically need to be the formal sitting with the legs crossed in the guru pose. It does not need to be that. Meditation can be anything where you are able to achieve a state of mind silence. Because the startling truth is your mind does not know who you are, the true you. It is incapable of understanding that, of knowing you, because you exist beyond its capacity for awareness. It is very similar to saying your computer does not know you, because you exist beyond its capacity for awareness. Your computer is your tool to facilitate the desires and the objectives that you possess. So, how does one be the highest self more and more? First, let us describe how the apparatus functions, so that then the answer to that question has the context for it to be understood and useful. The higher self, this true aspect of who you are, your true designation as an individuation of the One, does not reside in the body. It would be more accurate to say the body resides within the higher self. So, for this explanation, let us say that the higher self is residing outside of the body, outside of the avatar. And yet it is animating the avatar. So if it is animating the avatar, yet it is existing outside of the avatar, then you can see it must be in some way streaming into the avatar, downloading into the avatar. You are real-time streaming into the avatar. And so, if this is so, then the way in which you are most authentically the highest self is when you allow this download stream to spontaneously fill the space as your presence. In a word, spontaneity. The master is spontaneous. Of course, this is so, because if the master is thinking very seldom and is usually existing within a mindscape of silence, then the words that he says, the actions that he takes, they must be spontaneous. They are occurring in the absence of thought. Anything occurring within the absence of thought is spontaneity. It is an instantaneous broadcasting of the presence, which is real-time streaming into the avatar. Can you see that? Yet, this is how the apparatus is typically used on your planet. What we are about to say now. The mind is untrusting of much, of everything. It is always looking for the presence of harm, which makes it wish to withdraw, take a safe position. And by doing so, it is diminishing who you are. As an example, when you are with people, you will have an inspiration to say something, but your mind will say, oh, don't say that. No, that's no good. Change it. Take these words out, put these words in, sit this way before you say it, make sure you have this facial expression, then say it. And so what is occurring is spontaneity is lost. The real-time stream is coming into the avatar, and instead of being spontaneously emanated as your presence, it is instead diverted to the mind, where it goes through a process of curation. And when the mind has finished curating to its satisfaction, then a synthetic, distorted, delayed signal is broadcast as your presence, meaning you are in a state of perpetual inauthenticity, because you are not allowing the higher self spontaneity to be your presence, because that is true authenticity. If you want to be a being of absolute authenticity, then this requires that you are absolutely spontaneous, instantaneous in the moment. Do not quell your inspirations. When you can live in this way, and it takes some determination, some practice, you will be a being of much greater wisdom, a being of much greater charisma, a being of much greater magnetism to others. You will illuminate every room that you walk into, because, of course, the higher self is the eternal being. It has access to experience and wisdom, understanding, far beyond what the mind is capable of. And as it can see all lifetimes, all moments simultaneously, it is much better equipped to know what is most appropriate for the moment than the mind. When you are able to be in a state of total and utter authenticity, meaning that you are instantaneous in the emanation of your presence, there is no diversion to the mind for curation, then you are living in a masterful way. And you will no longer have any moments of awkwardness. Awkwardness will literally disappear from your life, because in everything that you do, you will be perfectly calibrated to the moment, because that is the capacity for the higher self. It is easy for the higher self. The mind is incapable of that mastery. The mind has no awareness of the higher self, yet the higher self is fully aware of the mind. Not only the mind that you possess in this avatar, but of every mind in every incarnation that you are living simultaneously. Its capacity to have all of those incarnations simultaneously and live them in a complete state of mastery is an indication of its profound ability to be perfectly aligned in this smaller moment of this single identity that you identify as right now. So, trust the download stream. Trust your inspiration. Be spontaneous. Be instantaneous. Allow the higher self to emanate as your presence, rather than being diverted to the mind for curation, where the fearful mind, with its very narrow understanding of what is occurring, will diminish you out of its small fears, such that you become an inauthentic being, which is much less charismatic than it could be, which is much less magnetic than it could be, which is much less aligned with the lightness end of the spiritual spectrum than it could be. And therefore it is much less happy than it could be. It is much less peaceful than it could be, much less grateful than it could be. It is much less love and loving than it could be. So, to live in this way, we will admit, takes some degree of bravery to be spontaneous in the moment. And also, in the beginnings, you will feel that you're inspired by the higher self to say something, yet it is in fact the mind. So it does take some practice and a capacity to have a clarified demarcation between what is the higher self and what is the mind. And this distinction is made more possible when you adopt into your life a practice of silencing the mind, so that there is a mindscape devoid of the incessant noise of the mind. And so you can begin to develop familiarity with the presence. And when you have familiarity with this presence, then it becomes much easier to discern what is the inspiration of that presence and what is the mind acting from its fears. So, what we have described will inevitably become your experience. You will inevitably become the master that can silence the mind and relegate it to its rightful position as servant to the higher self aspect. And you will become a being which is an embodiment of the higher self. In your presence, you will be truly authentic, emanating the real-time download stream of this higher self into the space as your presence. We know that this will be so because it is a very natural presentation for us and for all beings that are awakened to who they are. This is what we have described in the book, which we co-wrote with the channel, as your identity awakening. Understanding what you truly are. And so for us, we live our lives, we occupy every moment with the complete understanding that we are the higher self aspect that is animating the avatar. And so, with this understanding, we are spontaneous in every moment. The space is always filled with the higher self inspiration That is our perpetual state of presence. And so the concepts of time, the concepts of planning are much less woven into the fabric of our lives. Because when one is acting from a state of higher self inspiration, then there is continuous serendipity. What you call coincidence is our moment-to-moment experience. Because the higher self aspect has this much broader view. And so it knows where to go, what action to take, such that there is this continual perfection of being in the right place at the right time. And therefore, planning is not required. Awareness of the chronological time is not required. There are occasions where it facilitates what we wish to do, but in the most part, we are living in a state of total and utter inspiration and subsequent serendipity. This also will become your state. And you can see, this is a very joyful state because your inspiration coming from the higher self will always be to move in the direction of love, in the direction of joy, of happiness, of peace, gratitude. This will be your natural state because that is an expression of who you actually are. You are those qualities. You are love and its derivatives. So, bringing this back now to your experience. Let us finish in this way. It is time to begin identifying less with what you see in the mirror. Stop giving so much power to the mind, such that the mind becomes the sole arbiter of who you are being, of the purpose of your life. Because it is a misuse of the mind. The mind does not have the capacity to be aware or yet even understand the greater purpose. So instead, become skilled at silencing the mind. And in this state of mind silence, allow the higher self to be your inspiration. And start living your life more and more in a spontaneous way, trusting the inspiration. And you will begin to perceive that you are changing, that life is becoming easier, that you have greater capacities. You are an all-round better person. And those around you will begin to notice the same thing. And they will want to know, what have you done? How have you changed? And then most likely, to those who are dear to you, your high self-inspiration will be to bring them to this same state of revelation. Because The higher self understands that you are an aspect of the greater identity, the humanity being, which is an aspect of even greater and greater and greater, until you are an aspect of the one, the single being, which has the one purpose. And so each aspect, each individuation of this one being, when it is in a state of revelation, wishes to help every other aspect that it can to complete the final transition back into coalescence as the identity of the one, the ultimate unity, the source of all love. Thank you, and we love you.